Ptolemy said, "I know that I am mortal by nature, and ephemeral. But when I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch the earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia." I was first introduced to the topic of astrology by my mother. For as long as I can remember, she would be comforting me as I cried, calling me her sensitive Cancer, or praying my Leo rising when I put on a show. She could guess the sun signs of strangers she had just met with startling accuracy, and would gather me and my brother together every Wednesday for the weekly horoscopes published in our local community journal. Despite all her positive encouragement to integrate astrology as a part of my life, I strongly rejected the practice as pseudoscience by the time I was 12 years old. It is common that around this age, as nature begins to change our bodies, that nature also pushes us to define ourselves in a way that distinguishes us from our parents and any others that have been attempting to mold and shape us throughout early childhood.
My own path through this process nurtured a curiosity in history and human psychology. I wanted to know why I perceived my life and the world I lived in the way I did, and how the perception of my ancestors and the peoples they interacted with had shaped that. I was in my early 20s when my curiosity led me to the ideas of Carl Jung, specifically the Jungian archetypes. To Jung, the archetypes are characters, motifs, and any other pattern that appears universally throughout myths, art, and dreams since the beginning of recorded history, and even before, in the artifacts archaeologists have uncovered from prehistory. A simple example of an archetype is the mother. The archetype of the mother is not just your or my individual mother, but something more like a computer code, intrinsic and fundamental to our unconscious, and designed to match itself to an external entity, like the woman that nurses and nurtures us. The important thing to understand is that even if for some reason you don't have a mother, because she died giving birth to you, or if you were grown in a test tube, you will still have the concept of the mother in your psyche, because it exists a priori, or before you perceive it with your senses. Another example is the hero, or the one who proves themselves by facing great obstacles. We are all introduced to the hero by the stories we are told as children. But even if you never heard these stories, you will still perceive yourself as the hero of your life, the one who has something to prove and must overcome life's challenges. I was intrigued by this concept, and pursued it first in the mythology of the Greeks, for it was the most familiar to me. My first connection to astrology happened when I noticed the Greek gods shared attributes with the heavenly bodies or planets. This didn't come as a surprise, for the Roman counterparts of these gods are the namesakes of the planets. For example, Hermes is Mercury, Aphrodite is Venus, Ares is Mars, and so on. Then, as I read and learned more about the archetypes in these and other mythologies, I began to notice how the traits attributed to each matched the traits of the signs of the zodiac my mother had told me about as a child.
Anyone remotely familiar with astrology is aware that the wheel of the zodiac is a calendar, charting the seasons of nature and dividing the year into 12 even segments. This is why you are the same sign as everyone else that shares your birthday, with rare exceptions. Well, it occurred to me that the archetypes are also drawn from nature, for if they exist a priori, if they are an inherited program of the unconscious, then it must have been evolution that created them. Think of the advantage this provides us. If I meet a potential mate and I wish to build a connection with them, I might begin to discuss my life. In this discussion, my mother might come up. Now, if we both have the archetype of the mother as an a priori part of our unconscious, I will likely describe my mother in a way that highlights how she did or did not match the qualities of the mother, the one who nurses and nurtures. The potential mate will then do the same as they are listening to me, and from their response, I will unconsciously have an understanding that they share the archetype of the mother. This builds a bond and trust between me and my potential mate, and brings us closer together faster than potential couples who do not have these archetypes as a part of their unconscious. This is a huge reproductive and therefore evolutionary advantage. Mother Nature would want to reinforce and strengthen such equality, and must have done so, for look at how integrated these archetypes are in our society. They have been woven into the fabric of civilization. Every family has a head, every village has a chief, every city has a mayor, and every state has a leader. Every society has a ruler, the one who takes the responsibility of creating and sustaining a prosperous family or community. The zodiac and astrology is a calendar, a map, or a compass, guiding us through the mysterious maze of the unconscious by showing us how it is a reflection of the nature that surrounds us, the nature we can observe, interact with, and manipulate, the nature we can understand.
Learning this was the most important piece to my discovery of how astrology, an ancient, archaic school, labeled by many as nonsense, or at most an outdated form of astronomy, is actually more important and relevant to the world we live in today than it ever was. A world that seems to be growing farther from the traditions of its ancestors and the nature that bore them, and is therefore, for the first time, struggling with concepts it took for granted in the past. Who are we? Do we have a purpose here on this planet? Does life hold meaning? And if so, what is it? Astrology, the heavenly bodies, the signs, and the charts do not have the answers to these questions, but they tell us where we can look. Recall before, when I mentioned my rejection of my mother's tutelage in astrology? I was around the age of 12 when I began to carve an identity separate from the ones my parents had dreamed up for me. In Greek and Roman mythology, Zeus, or Jupiter, is the king of the gods. It was his destiny to overthrow his father the king, tear down the old world order of the Titans, and divide the new world appropriately. In a strong sense, this is what I was doing at that time. I had to overthrow the king in my mind, created by my parents to guide me. I had to tear down their old world order, the beliefs and ideas they had shared with me. And I had to divide my new world appropriately, to discover and create my own ideas about who I was and how this world around me worked. I was young and immature, and I still had, and still have, a long way to go. But it was an important step for me to take, especially as my body was changing too. I, like almost everyone else my age, was an indignant and skeptical pubescent 12-year-old. 12 years before, the planet Jupiter had been in almost exactly the same position on the day I was born. It had gone one time all the way around the sun since then. It was the time of my Jupiter returns.